Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha, who was raised, he was the son of a king who didn't want him to be a spiritual figure. He wanted him to be a political figure. So Siddhartha's father made sure that there was never any unpleasantness that Siddhartha was aware of. Surrounded him with luxury and dancing girls and musicians and acrobats. And the Buddha talked about how there was a blue lotus pool and a white lotus pool and a red lotus pool. So all kinds of luxury. But when the Buddha was 29, he demanded that his charioteer take him out into the city. He'd never been out into the city before, except in processions that his father had arranged to control what Siddhartha saw. And so on this trip, Siddhartha saw a sick person, and he'd never seen a sick person before. So he said to his charioteer, "What's wrong with that person?" And the charioteer answered that that person was sick. And the Buddha said, "Does everybody get sick?" And the charioteer said, "Yes." And the Buddha said, "Will I get sick?" And the charioteer said, "Yes." And this was a revelation to the Buddha, to Siddhartha. On the next trip out into the city, they saw an old person. And Siddhartha had never seen an old person before. So he asked the charioteer, "What's wrong with that person?" And the charioteer explained about old age. And the Buddha said, "Does everybody get old?" And the charioteer said, "Yes." And the Buddha said, "Will I get old?" And the charioteer said, "Yes." And on the next visit out into the city, they saw a corpse being carried through the streets. And Siddhartha said, "What's wrong with that person?" And the charioteer explained that that person was dead and what death meant. And the Buddha said, "Does everybody die?" And the charioteer said, "Yes." And Siddhartha said, "Will I die?" And the charioteer said, "Yes." And then on the fourth visit out into the city, they saw a wandering monk, an ascetic. And Siddhartha said, "What's going on with that person?" And the charioteer explained that it was a person who had given up worldly comforts to seek spiritual knowledge. And the Buddha said, "Can anybody do that?" Or Siddhartha said, "Can anybody do that?" And the charioteer said, "Yes." And Siddhartha said, "Could I do that?" And the charioteer said, "Yes." So Siddhartha went back to the palace, and he thought deeply on all that he had seen. These, by the way, are called the four heavenly messengers: the sick person, the old person, the dead person, and the ascetic, wandering ascetic. And they changed Siddhartha's life. He became deeply motivated to figure out what the cause of suffering is and how to find freedom from suffering. Not so much to relieve his own suffering as to relieve the suffering of all beings. And so in the middle of the night, he left the palace, leaving his young wife and baby behind, and went out cut his long hair to signify that he was giving up membership in the warrior caste, and went out and found a meditation teacher and stayed with that teacher for about a year and mastered everything that teacher had to teach him. And then found another meditation teacher, mastered everything that teacher had to teach him about meditation. Felt neither one of those was going to bring an end to suffering. So he went out into the forest as a wandering ascetic and joined a group of 5 hermits, spiritual seekers, and lived a very hard life for 5 or 6 years, where the scriptures say by the end he was only eating 1 grain of rice a day. He was starving to death. And one day he sat down by the roadside and thought to himself, this is not bringing an end to suffering. This is not the right path. And so he remembered a time when he was about 7 years old, when he'd had a spontaneous enlightenment experience. And I remembered that he'd been deeply aware of the harvest or sowing, actually, ritual that was going on in the fields around him, that his father, the king, was leading for the planting of the crops. And Siddhartha, as a child, became deeply aware of everything around him and of all the insects that were being killed as the plow went through the ground. And he thought at this moment, when he's sitting on the side of the road starving to death and deciding that asceticism was not the path to freedom from suffering, he decided to try that mindfulness that he had spontaneously experienced as a child. And he sat down under the Bodhi tree and swore that he was going to sit there until he either achieved enlightenment or died. And the scriptures say that in the period of 1 night, he became enlightened. So I was thinking about the 4 heavenly messengers because of the COVID-19 virus, that so often the teachers in our lives are times of hardship. I know I would never have started meditating if I hadn't been drastically ill with no diagnosis. And so I honestly feel that the illness, while it has been a burden for 30-some years, it also gave me the spiritual path that has so greatly reduced my suffering. And that I'm not saying it's a good thing to have a 30-year-long illness, but I am saying that hardship often inspires us to reach deeper into ourselves, to find truths that would be hidden from us without the hardship. And that perhaps COVID-19 can function like this for us as individuals and as a society. We are poised on the edge of major climate change. If we don't change our way of living, it will be catastrophic for the earth. And COVID-19, by shutting everything down, may give us the opportunity to forge a more sane economy and way of life that doesn't threaten the life of the planet or the life of all beings on the planet. Are there any thoughts or observations or questions about that basic